Welcome back. Well, more, of course, coming from that briefing by the ANC Secretary-General, Fikile Mbalula. He outlined which parties the ANC would definitely not work with in a coalition. All right, well, they seem to be suggesting that they won't work with the Democratic Alliance, but that they will work with the economic freedom fighters. This, of course, comes as Joburg is without a mayor again this afternoon. Various political parties still examining the ANC proposals to manage coalitions. The ANC says while it still wants to win elections next year, it's also making plans to manage coalitions and about who it will work with. Hence, Fikile Mbalula's comment today that they would work with the EFF but not with the DA. Pranish Desai is a data analyst at Good Governance Africa. Pranish, good afternoon to you. It's really interesting. I mean, it's not just the ANC that's looking at its proposals for coalitions. Other parties are looking at the kind of principles they may follow. The optimist in me wants to think this is maybe an important moment, that our parties are beginning to mature when it comes to managing coalitions.
Good afternoon, Stephen. Great to be with you and your viewers again. I'm inclined to agree with you in terms of taking somewhat of an optimistic look at this. 6 months ago, the various political parties and the government weren't really acknowledging coalition instability as a problem. Right now, at least we have the major political parties and the various government departments beginning to look into the issue, thinking about what sort of proposals they might introduce to stabilize the system so that we can have a system that's capable of, delivering for citizens on a more consistent basis than the current system is right now. We should obviously have tempered optimism. It's clear that these remedies that are being proposed, whether it's by the national departments or by the ANC or by the DA, won't turn into legislation in the near future. It's quite unlikely that we'll have it, in fact, before next year's elections, especially for local government level. But, we're at least moving somewhere whereas a few months ago we weren't moving anywhere. We're just having instability.
The pessimist in me says that the real test is not about the principles that parties make. It's about whether they stick to those principles when they're faced with losing power. Or to put it another way, if they could break those principles and retain power, will they do that? Pranish, I'm afraid I've grown quite cynical in my old age. I don't know if they would stick to their principles. I think most of them would grab the power. The
history of this in politics, whether it's in South Africa or globally, does show an inclination by parties and politicians to want to hold on and keep to their power as much as possible. I think it partly relates to the nature of an electoral defeat as well. If it's a resounding rejection, then, there's not much a party in the South African setting can do to hold on to power unless it's in a very much, smaller role, and that they themselves can feel is a potentially humiliating role. So, on the one hand, there will be an inclination to stay in power, but on the other hand, it also depends on how strong the message the electorate sends is, because depending on the strength of that, it could lead to a variety of different outcomes.
There are all sorts of issues that are happening at the moment. So, for example, and there's a sort of test of this. The ANC, David Mukura, he's the person who runs their sort of committee on coalition, said over the weekend one of the proposals they would like to make is that you would never, as a bigger party, support a smaller party. That's automatically the party that gets the biggest share of the vote in a council or a provincial legislature would appoint the mayor or the premier. So that makes sense. But in Joburg right now, they're not following that principle. The ANC voted for Tapelo Ahmad, and I think are likely to vote for another minority party member in Joburg. So we're now stuck with this sort of duality. This is a proposal we may follow, but we're not following it right now.
No, the duality is undeniably there. I also listened to what former Premier Mukura had to say. And, it is encouraging that the ANC or the DA that are looking elsewhere in the world where coalition governments are a lot more common, to see what sort of norms are there that we can instill in South Africa. And he was correct in saying that one of them is that the leading party in a council after an election is the one which generally has sort of the first choice to form a coalition. But in practice, it's just going to take a while for parties, including the ANC itself, to actually develop a coherent approach that they're actually willing to carry out in practice. One of the issues regarding Gauteng specifically and the 3 Gauteng metros is that, here the political especially in the post-election setting, the political situation is just a lot more complex. There isn't any clear leading party, to the extent that there is in most provinces in the country. So Gauteng itself is probably in for a bit more of an unstable run than the rest of the country. And of course, the main concern there is that Gauteng remains the economic hub of the country. So issues there can impact the confidence citizens as a whole have in the system itself.
There's so many other things. I mean, again, there's, for example, the idea of limiting the number of times that you could have a confidence vote in a mayor, and that's to stop the instability you talk about. And the ANC, I think, seems quite keen on that, and the Democratic Alliance seems quite keen on that, and when the two biggest parties in the National Assembly are keen on something, they can vote in favour of it. And sure, I mean, that might bring stability, but it would also mean that if, for example, a minority party mayor lost the support of the two bigger parties that were supporting her, she may just decide to stay in power and no one could remove her. Or you could have your annual confidence vote and Stephen Curtis as mayor of, I don't know, Newzroom Afrika. And then I win it, and the next day evidence could emerge against Stephen Curtis. And you can't actually bring a confidence vote against me because you've already had it for the year. I mean, we need to think through some of these things quite carefully.
No, definitely. There will be trade-offs made in some cases, as you've identified. The issue of no confidence votes is a very critical one because in and of themselves, no confidence votes within a democratically elected council or parliament are an expression of democratic sentiment. These people who voted there. But there are complexities in regards to whether limiting them is the right sort of route to go for. There are other proposals such as whether, the collective executive system might reduce the amount of political bartering that occurs between political parties so that positions such as the mayor itself aren't as coveted because it simply isn't that important anymore. But, as we move towards a more stable, hopefully a more stable framework, we do need to carefully think about these various trade-offs we'll need to make along the way. And that's why I'm not anticipating that at least at the local level that we'll see the Municipal Structures Act actually modified ahead of next elections. I think it's much more likely that we'll have the new system in place ahead of 2026.
It's fascinating to watch which parties support what when. So, as an example, the Democratic Alliance is supporting a limitation on how often you can bring confidence votes now because they know what happened to their mayor in Tshwane. The ANC is supporting the change to a collective executive system, so where most of the parties in a council would get a position on the mayoral committee. I think eThekwini is governed like that. But the ANC never supported such a system when it was dominant in most of the councils in the country, and suddenly, as if by magic, it's supporting it now. Isn't it quite fun to watch who's supporting what when? Kind of reveals what they want, doesn't it?
No, it really does reveal how short-term a lot of politics is. Your problem yesterday is now the thing that you're trying to resolve today, but and your solution for tomorrow is something you viewed as unnecessary 5 years ago. So it does point out that, this thing is entirely fluid and that, and also from a citizen's perspective and from a civic society or media perspective, this is partly an issue of teething problems within a young democracy. We are moving into a transitory phase in our democracy. And, these sorts of things can be expected. Political parties themselves are trying to navigate these new, more uncertain waters, essentially. So, we will need to accept that there will be some level of instability endemic in all of this transitional phase. But how do we reduce the extent of that instability and how do we insulate some basic functions of government from that instability so that, people still get piped water into their households. People still get adequate electricity. Poor households are still supported through free basic services policy. That's a sort of, question that we need to answer, and we need to have a system capable of answering that question.
For me, and this is just a personal view, but one of the most obvious things would be to remove the right of councillors to vote for mayors and speakers through secret ballot. I understand the argument for it, but it means that you and I as voters will will vote for a councillor, and we don't know who that councillor then votes for. And we saw in Tshwane claims and maybe a bit of evidence of sort of vote buying, but we see allegations. Basically, just brings lying into the system and a lack of transparency. I think, if I remember correctly, the DA supports the change. I haven't seen the ANC suggesting that. Maybe they have. But where do you stand? Would that make a difference to remove the idea of councillors voting by secret ballot for mayors and speakers? To me, it's just basically allowing lying into the system.
I think that there's a very strong accountability and transparency reason, as you've laid out, for doing away with the secret ballot system. You know, the question, as it always is in politics, is whether, you know, councillors will vote to give away rights that they currently are enjoying exploiting. So, you know, while we can advocate for that change, and I would make an argument for that change, it's just not clear whether we'd actually see that change happen.
It would seem to me, Pranish, that for the leaderships of political parties, it's actually in their interest, isn't it? Because it means, you know, we see so often, like we saw in Mangaung, the ANC didn't really know which of its councillors voted against the ANC, unless they said so, because of the secret ballot issue. So the trick, of course, is to go through the leaderships of parties. You make the leaders do it, and then they'll force their councillors to do it.
Yep, certainly that's probably the most politically realistic way in which such a change could happen. The only relevant concern then is, you know, whether political party leaderships themselves are specifically interested in doing that for the right reasons, or as part of doing away with the secret ballot, will they introduce other less transparent mechanisms to sort of replace that, but keep themselves still somewhat insulated from being pressurized by, you know, the voting public. We've seen already in terms of how, you know, the parliament's dealt with an issue like the Electoral Amendment Bill, where there was some pretty clear guidelines provided by the Concourt around, you know, the nature of accountability and the importance of giving independent candidates a chance to stand. And yet, when the actual final bill came out, it was clearly pretty haphazard bill, and, you know, one that no one's particularly satisfied by. And both the President and the Home Affairs Minister was responsible for drafting it and signing it respectively, are both indicating that we'll probably just have, you know, they'll just kick the can down to the next Parliament and we'll have to go through the whole electoral reform issue again. So, you know, when changing the system, there are also these various, you know, spanners that can be thrown in.
Pranish Desai, thank you, Data Analyst at Good Governance Africa. Do appreciate the time.